And so one of the things that happens it seems to me in a biography is you're trying to get the whole gamut of what one's contribution is, what one thinks about it. I guess my view about it is your bent, and which I think is a good bent, is to try to get at the human dimensionality of what the change was in the Army about all that. And I think that I was certainly formative in working that issue.
Right.
And I don't, there's no denying that. I think anybody that's got a grain of sense would understand that. So it is not I'm afraid that if you bill it as a biography, it will not have the same appeal mechanism that it will have as a story about the human dimension of the Army, which after all is the Army. I mean, the Army is human beings, not machines.
Right.
And I just think that when you get, so you're going up in a time frame which is, Colin Powell's going to come out in his memoirs. Rick Atkinson has taken Schwarzkopf and Barton and all the like, and so the point is that who is this guy Thurman? I mean, they don't know, but the American public has long since forgotten who he is. You follow me? In the main.
I don't intend to compete in a popular market. Probably a university press will be what I'll look for, though. I may end up with Sage or Greenwood or somebody like that. I would like this thing to be a good deal more serious. Did you ever read Alan Millett's biography of General Bullard?
No.
It's the best military biography I've ever read, and its subtitle is Robert Bullard and Officership in the United States Army from the 1880s to 1925 or so. That's kind of what I like to model it on. I think it's very important for people who are your heirs in the Army to know something that they can't possibly know except through a book or whatever. And that's what the Army was like between 1953 and 1965. It doesn't have any bite to it if I were to make general statements. But if I can talk about what you did and what your first sergeants were like, how many privates you had that you had to court-martial, who were, total slugs, what your battalion commanders and S3s knew, what your battery commanders did to develop you. This will give a picture of what the old Army really was.
So you're going to do it from 53 to 65?
Well, that's sort of when the problem areas were. And then we get into Vietnam and sort of a crisis of confidence. And out of that came a bunch of guys like you, and Bob Elton, and Croce, and a whole bunch of fascinating people. Different kinds of officers, I think, than came out of the Second World War, and with different values. And this is where it's a long cautionary tale, because it's so easy to slip into the world owes me a living kind of atmosphere that I think was around in the 50s.
Yeah, let me say to you, though, that if you look at my track record, it won't be viewed as reliable in that I lived with a force much, because I didn't. If you look back at my particular record, and I don't know whether you've looked at it in detail, but
Your troop duty comprised the 11th Airborne, and then
11th Airborne, then I go off, I never command a battery.
no, you never commanded.
That's a very unusual thing, so people would say, he doesn't know shit about what went on with the troops. The second thing is, I never was a battalion staff officer, okay? And so the next time I come around as a commander, after being a platoon commander, I'm a battalion commander. And then I'm a battalion commander for 8 months. And then the next time I come around as a party commander. And no other troop duty, you follow me? So
right.
That's one reason that Richard Halloran ran a very interesting editorial in the New York, not editorial, but a article in the New York Times in 1981 when I was advanced to the grade of lieutenant general, that he talked about Scheimeyer promoting the 21 generals to the grade of lieutenant general, some huge number like that, maybe 15 or whatever. And he went down and ticked all these guys off, and he said, and Thurman is a manager. You follow me? Because I hadn't been a division, hadn't been an ADC, hadn't been a division commander, and now I'm getting advanced to the grade of lieutenant general. So I think you have to watch how you portray my knowledge base of the details of what the Army was doing in the field. In other words, I never put down a race riot in Germany.
Right.
And there are plenty of people that did.
Yeah.
So I think you have to be careful about, is he a true nobody could make it to the top like I did today. Nobody.
No, you have to get all the punches. And even at the time that you were doing it, very few people did, though. I must say there are a lot of people who have very few commands who got to very high ranks in the 60s, 70s era.
Well, proceed on whatever track you want to. I'm just saying, even when I read letter 2, it says we're going to talk about the human dimension.
Yeah.
And oh, by the way, we look at this as a biography. I don't have any trouble looking at it from the human dimension. I think when you look at that, the biographical notion, if you're trying to treat it fulsomely, begins to dwindle, and you're concentrating on one aspect. And that's fine. I don't have trouble with concentrating on the one aspect if that's what you feel you're comfortable doing.
Well, yes.
Okay, so moving along, it'll shape as you see what it is you want to do here. But
Well, of course, it may take some turns, that's for sure.
No, I understand.
I don't know you well at all. I learned a lot of what I thought was a lot about you from Dave Marlowe, because he saw you frequently, and he would say what your perceptions and attitudes were and what projects you were backing, and I thought that was good. And then I met you once in, it was March of 1987. Dave asked me to come along and help with the briefing, and to my astonishment, I found myself talking to you about one of the problems in the 7th Division was that a number of the officers were insecure, so they just didn't have the confidence to implement the much more demanding leadership that co-corps requires. And we were talking substantively about this, and I had never met another officer in the Army who was ready to engage on that kind of a issue. And so I got interested in you, as you, I think you must have, I don't know how you got away with it.
Got away with what?
With being so independent, telling them to take their battery command and stick it, imposing your will about what branch you were going to be in when you were a second lieutenant, grabbing a battalion command by the throat, and being an independent thinker. I understand how you were able to do what you did to recruiting command, because you had backing all the way up. That was...
Had backing all the way up, but nobody got into what we did.
No, that was... But see, and also...
Authority came out and said...
Fix it.
Fix it, and we'll support you. Now you go figure out what fix it means.
I know that. Yeah. And then the whole fix-it idea, I mean, recruiting command was run by NCOs for generations.
You bet.
And you were the first one who had the
Discovered it.
independence, I think. I mean, people must have known.
No, confidence.
Is that what it was?
Sure.
Yeah. So
Be confident even when wrong.
Mm.
So one of the things you have to, I think this is true of any leader, I mean, whether he's a manager or a leader, is you have to, in a scene of ambiguity, which is what war is all about,
That's what it's all about.
you have to be very confident and radiate that confidence down to the troops so they get behind you and do what it is you want to get done.
Yeah, they feel
And that's-
safe.
They feel very safe, very comfortable, because they feel that you know where it is you want to go, and they're able to get on board and help you do that. If there's a long suit I have, I think it's that. That is to say, the ability to plot a course and make something happen.
It does seem to be a thread
You know,
that runs
and,
right through your life.
And I look at some of the things that are currently going on, let's say in our foreign policy or our national security policy in the United States at the moment. And it's because it's ambiguous. And so nobody has seized the nettle and gone and said, here's what we're going to do, and let's all get behind it and go do it. Rather, it's sort of, well, gee whiz, that doesn't seem to work, going to back off. Gee whiz, we'll try something else. If that doesn't work, we'll back off. And I think that is, in a military organization, it's dispiriting. People expect the bosses in a military organization to know what it is we're going to do and then go out and do it. People in the military want to be told what to do. They don't want to necessarily be told how to do it down at the net eyeball, but they want to be told what it is, what standards we have to maintain. The series of Bolar was a terrible bust. It was because we said, gee whiz, we will lose our standards. And people said, we're actually going to have beer in the mess hall or in the barracks, we put in the Bolar, and pretty soon you just come in and say, we're not doing that. Not only that, we're not drinking. They put the squeeze on it, and everybody says, you can't tell people that. We did that in the mid-'80s. Wickham did that as Chief of Staff of the Army, and I remember him coming in to see me one day, and he said, what do you think about if I just knock off happy hours and 2-for-1 drinks and all that? So it was a terrific idea. Go do it. It's fine. And everybody says you're more righteous than thou and all that. The fact is, you look around the Army today, and people are not in the debauchery state that you found the Navy in at the tail end.
Oh, when you came in the Army, it was almost obligatory to be an alcoholic.
Oh, well, I mean, if you went in the airborne, you had my early career in the 80s in the 11th Airborne Division, you had to get drunk at the prop labs. If you didn't do that, you weren't a member of the club.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, how do you want to proceed today, sir?
Well, if these tapes are the same as what...
And you don't need those.
I don't need those.
Right.
I'd like to talk about the 11th Airborne.
Okay.
Let's see, did you have any assignments prior to the Ordnance Corps basic course?
No, I graduated from college, North Carolina State University, with a bachelor's in chemical engineering, and had interviewed, because it was the tail end of the Korean War, and had interviewed with several chemical firms.
Right, you actually had a job.
Yeah, and I went to work for Carbide and Carbon Chemicals Company in Charleston, West Virginia, and polyethylene plant. And after being there 6 weeks or so, I got inducted into the United States Army at Aberdeen Proving Grounds, and went to the basic course there. And in the course of doing that, I was brought in from the Reserve Component. I was a distinguished military graduate from NC State, happened to be the cadet colonel down there, brigade commander, whatever you want to call it, the big muckety-muck. And so they gave me a DMG, Distinguished Military Graduate, opportunity, but I didn't take it. So I was going out and earn my fortune in industry. So I got called to duty as a reservist, still at the tail end of the Korean War, and went to Aberdeen, and while I was there, I couldn't stand it. That is to say, the Ordnance Corps. Now, the Ordnance Corps isn't bad, it was what they were teaching us at the time. What they were teaching us at the time were spare parts management and ordering. So they would bring you in huge lists of standard nomenclature lists, tons of papers. And you were supposed to go through there and find a Part X and what the federal stock number was. Then I got my first set of orders, which was to the Anniston General Depot as a supply officer. And I said, like hell, I'm not going to be in the Army for a 2-year stint. Go to Anniston and issue paper down there, spare parts and all that kind of stuff. So then I exercised my right, which you had a right for a 1-year application to be a regular Army officer. So I exercised that right. And so I wanted to go in the field artillery. And the Adjutant General of the Army came back at that time and said there is no more room in the field artillery. And through the intervention of the then Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, serendipitously, who was a field artillery officer, General Williston B. Palmer, he hauled up the Adjutant General and said, "Are you telling me you're so careful at making judgments about the longevity of officers that one more lieutenant in the field artillery would break the bank?" And he said, "Put him in the field artillery." So then I had to pass the physical for field artillery, which I couldn't pass because I had a bad eye. Congenital. I don't want 20/50, non-correctable. 20/40, 20/50. Still see out of it, still get some peripheral vision, but it was a deficiency at the time. So they say turned him down for a regular Army appointment. So then I was able to get a waiver for service in the regular Army through the efforts of then Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, General Williston B. Palmer, who called the Surgeon General up and said, "What's wrong with this guy Thurman? Why can't he be a lieutenant of field artillery?" So we came past the eye physical and said, "Well, don't you get waivers?" And call the board together and see if he can get a waiver. So they came back to the Vice Chief and said, "Okay, he's waiverable."
Why were you so hot for the field artillery?
Well, my father had been in the field artillery as a sergeant in World War I. He was a National Guardsman for the state of Tennessee. He had been in the field artillery. My brother was a field artillery officer, so I knew about it. And so that's why I wanted to go. I mean, I didn't have any expose on the guns personally or anything, but it appealed to me. It had some mathematical undergirding to it, and I had done well in mathematics and science. And chemical explosions are what happens when you torch the tube and get ready to fire a round. So it fit with my general view of what I was going to do. And incidentally, I was only going to be in the Army 3 years, so I figured that's what I wanted to do. So if the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army hadn't intervened, I wouldn't have been there. Probably ended up as a supply clerk in
Gotten out in 2 years.
Anniston, Alabama, and gotten out in 2 years. So that is how I got into the regular Army component and how I got into the field artillery. So I went directly from Aberdeen Proving Grounds to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and took another basic course. So I had 2 back-to-back basic courses. And then while I was at Fort Sill, I applied for airborne school and went from Fort Sill to Benning and took parachute school. And I was sort of unremarkable. On my 3rd jump, a guy landed in my parachute and got hung up in it. Both of us came in on my reserve. He broke his back and I didn't. And
Did he collapse your chute?
Yeah.
Then you deployed your reserve?
So 2 guys on 1 reserve.
Was it a pretty high altitude jump?
No, we were jumping at 1,000 feet, and
Not much time to do all that.
he had he landed on my canopy, and it was an equipment jump, and we didn't have a weapons container at that time. You had your rifle and you tied it down upside down with the stock underneath your arm, and he jammed the muzzle of the rifle in the skirt of the chute so that the hem of the skirt lay between his body and the rifle. That hem is several thousand test pounds, so it doesn't break easily. And he was trying to rip the skirt, but he obviously couldn't do that.
Was his chute open?
No, his chute was, by now his chute had collapsed down below me,
Oh.
and because of the drag, I mean, I looked up and I saw my chute be getting dragged down, so I said, geez, I guess it's time for a reserve pull. So I pulled my reserve, and there was none of this feeding it out. It popped right along, and he hit the ground, and I got a little respite. I got a little bounce out of that because he was hanging below me about 30 feet. And so I got about a 30-foot cushion on that. And I came in and I sprained my ankle terribly. And so there's a football player in my class, a guy named Bob Sickholtz, who later becomes the head of the stadium, the DC Stadium Armory, or DC Armory Stadium complex, running the RFK Stadium. And Sickholtz was a football player, and I said, I want you to mobilize my ankle, which he did. And I made 2 more jumps on that for graduation, then went on to jump master school, made 3 more on that. Then when I cut it off, cut the bandage off, the tape off, my ankle ballooned up about twice its size, and other than that, I didn't have any major problems out of the jump school. Then I went from there to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and was assigned to Battery C of the 457 Airborne Field Artillery Battalion in the 11th Airborne Division Artillery. And sort of my entry went like this. The sergeant major was a guy named Leroy Browning. And Sergeant Major Browning would later die as the sergeant major of the 101st Division Artillery in Vietnam. And he and his commander was a guy named Richard Pohl. And Browning said to me, I know your brother. He was in the 187 Regimental Combat Team with me in Korea, and he said, I'll take care of you for 30 days and then you're on your own, Lieutenant. And so that was sort of the nature of the NCO Corps at that particular time. The Airborne was a very tight fraternity between the 82nd, the 11th, and this is the tail end of the Korean War, so a lot of people had served together in the 187 overseas with Korea. So I went straight to a battery, which was a 105 M109, no, a 105, 101A1 field artillery outfit. And I became the battery reconnaissance and survey officer. So that's how I got started in the Airborne. Now came into service in July of '53, and now when I get to the unit, it is like April of '54.
How many officers were there in the battery then?
Well, it's interesting that you ask that because there were 11 officers in the battery at the time. It was grossly overstrength in officers.
So they had some guys with no jobs then?
A lot of them. And
so normal about 7?
yeah, normally you would have had 3 FOs and a RO is 4, a battery exec and a assistant exec, so that'd be 6, and a battery commander 7. So we overstrength in officers. But and that's the reason I wasn't a battery exec. Battery exec is a critical job. You know, you're running the guns,
Right.
There was 8 officers. One was an FDO, Fire Direction Officer. So those are sort of the 2 principal offices in the battery at the time, and I was in Battery RO, reconnaissance.
You got a job even though you were the newest guy, and there were probably 2 or 3 other guys who had no jobs, right?
Yeah.
But is
My
that-
battery commander was an old salt. He'd served, and a lot of the officers in the 11th Airborne Division were veterans of World War II. A lot of them have gone up through the ranks.
Have they been pre-war enlisted men, pre-World War II?
Well, at least they started the war as enlisted men. Well, how much before the war, I couldn't tell you, but my guy was an expert marksman. And he would get up every morning and go to the range and shoot his pistol. And
By himself, or?
well, I mean, I don't know. He sort of didn't come to work till about 9 o'clock.
I see,
And he'd been
okay.
out shooting his weapon. Where in the hell he was doing it, and who
Right,
with, and all
okay.
that, I had
Yeah,
no
okay.
idea.
It wasn't the
And,
battery going out then.
And so the battery was rather loosely run. I mean, from a command standpoint. Although this guy had been a battery commander in Korea. And it was at least his 2nd battery, might have been his 3rd. And so it's fairly laid back. And we had basic training, advanced individual trainees at the time. We got them out of the division was sort of filled up with draftees, and we organized the battery around training trainees as opposed to having them all trained in the training base.
Okay, the training base did the basic training?
Yep.
And
Then
you
we got them
as
for advanced
AIT.
individual training.
Okay.
And we had in there people with 2 or 3 years college, because it was the last vestiges of the Korean draftees, and so I had a rich population of troops, and they were all good troops, so we had pretty interesting opportunity for excellence there.
Well, how many of them was the battery huge?
No, the battery was a little bit overstrength. I'd say the battery had about 110% strength, and so with as I recall, the gun crew size was about 9. So the battery had a population of about 130 to 40 people.
And you have so many NCOs that they held all the jobs like gunner and assistant gunner, or did the trainees
Yeah,
have jobs
they
like that?
Had well-staffed and non-commissioned officers. And the non-commissioned officers were sort of 2 ilks. One were again, people who had come up in the ranks in Korea by virtue of re-enlisting in Korea and extending in Korea. There were opportunities for promotion upward that wouldn't have been available to you in the United States on a quota basis. But over there, if you occupied the job for 30 days, you got the rank. So we had a large number of chiefs of smoke. Those are the gun chief. It's the sergeant in charge of 6 guns. Who really didn't know what I'd call basic civilian or basic cantonment soldier. But they had stayed in Korea long enough to get ranked, so they were grade E6, E7.
But they only had 2 or 3 years service.
And they had very modest amount of service. But they were smart enough to have gone over there and served. But then when you brought them back into training, basic trainees and the like, there was a lot of opportunity for them to get increased in their skills. And at that time, there were no NCO schools like we know currently. The division commander was an interesting fellow. He's a guy named Wayne C. Smith. He'd commanded the 7th Division at Fort Chop Hill. And he came back and he had to the 11th and took over the 11th. And one of the things he looked at was this panoply of young officers that he had, which were overstrength. And one of the rules he said was you had to go to a series of junior officers' schools or otherwise you would not be promoted to the grade of the next grade. So at that time, you had to have a recommendation upward to get promoted. It wasn't automatic from the Department of the Army. It wasn't automatically on time, but you had to have a recommendation to get that done.
From what level? From battery commander, or did it have to come from division commander?
The division commander had to recommend a division commander for you to be promoted from the grade of second lieutenant to first lieutenant.
And the division commander have authority to?
He had authority to
do it.
promote you or not promote you.
Okay.
So Wayne Smith invoked the authority not to promote you unless you'd been to his schools. And I got caught up in that, as a matter of fact. And it wasn't because, see, it wasn't me getting to the schools, it was my battery commander getting me to the school. You follow me?
I am.
So my battery commander wasn't very diligent about getting me to school, so I got knocked 30 days' pay, for example, when I get promoted from second lieutenant to first lieutenant. In those days, the promotion was supposed to be made in about 18 months on an average basis. It took me 19 because I didn't complete all the schools, and I had to stick around and get the schools completed because my battery commander was here's a case where he wasn't taking care of his troops.
What were the schools related to? Gunnery or administration or maintenance or
Well,
what?
Wayne Smith had a series of hurdles you had to pass. And if you look at those hurdles, although there was a lot of grousing about them at the time, that series of hurdles is not a bad paradigm for anybody. For example, and I'll come to that later as a TRADOC commander. Well, I'll come back to it as a division commander, come back to it as a TRADOC commander. Wayne Smith said, that division commander said, you must complete a 25-mile road march in X amount of time with your full field gear. That doesn't seem like to be onerous. You must complete compass course of certain duration. You must complete and fire your weapon expert. And if you are a member of an artillery unit, you have to do not only the carbine, which is our personal weapon at that time, but you also had to do the 105 howitzer.
You had to be an expert gunner?
Yeah.
They gave gunners tests?
Yeah.
How about for the enlisted men?
Yeah.
Okay, so all throughout the division?
Yeah. But for officers, you couldn't get promoted.
Right.
Yeah. Then he said you had to go to aerial observer school, forward observer school, mess management school, and wheel vehicle maintenance school. That doesn't seem like too hard.
Are these all like a couple of weeks?
A couple of weeks. In other words, aerial observer was 1 week, as I recall it. Forward observer was 1 week. Mess management was 2. 1 week of theory and 1 week of cooking.
Oh, you really got into
So I was in a mess hall cooking as a second lieutenant.
in your own battery or somewhere else?
No, we had somebody else's battery. You never did this in your own battery. There was a dining facility set up for us to do our work in, and fed in that mess hall were the airborne trainees for people going to jump school. We had a capability to train people at Fort Campbell. These AIT people that we brought in were being trained there. So, for example, I'll never forget, as long as I live, cooking SOS in the mess hall one morning at 3 o'clock. And we were cooking on wood stoves. And they had a sergeant, cook running our shift. And I was in there making SOS, and the coal stoves burnt. They get a back pressure in there. And when the soot settled out of this stove,
It's SOS.
there must have been a ½ inch of soot on top of the SOS. So I turned to the sergeant and I said, I guess we better get out the alternative meal, which would be eggs or something like that, because we were now going to get behind in serving the chow to the troops. And he looked at me dead in the lights and he said, keep on stirring, Lieutenant, keep on stirring. Ain't you never heard of charcoal broiled SOS? So I stirred the ½ inch of soot in there, and it was, almost black. So when these kids came through and they got their toast at one end, and he got a ladle of black SOS on their tray. It was hilarious at the time. But we had to cook in the school and do all that, and if you didn't do it, you didn't get promoted. Pretty simple.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody got right with it, and most battery commanders got right with it. Now,
And was there a series of battery tests and so on going on
well,
concurrently?
we were trainees.
So you didn't do that sort of thing?
So we were mainly trying to get the trainees up and trained, going through their, whether it was 12 weeks, I can't remember, essentially a 12-week POI. And then it was a train and retain proposition. We
Okay, so you
retained-
didn't have cycles of them?
No.
So you could go to battery test afterwards?
Took our troops, got them through that, then we went into an Army training program to go through the battery test and on through the battalion test. Now, in the course of the work, this captain, who had been my battery commander, departed. And I got a new battery commander.
This was after, what, 3 or 4 months? No, I guess
Yeah,
more than that.
this is within 6 months. And and the trainees were now ours, and now we were getting ready to train up to be through the battery test and on through the battalion test. We started getting our annual qualification getting ready to go. And we had a battalion commander who had been in combat in Korea, and the way he wanted to run his preparatory work for the battalion test was we left every Monday morning, but 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, went out to the field, shot all day, did our work, came back in the afternoon about sundown, cleaned up all the howitzers, and got to bed about midnight after doing all that, and got up the next morning at 4 o'clock and went back field did the same day. Well, after about 3 or 4 weeks of that, troops were dead.
Pretty good troops.
So
the last 3 or
then
4 weeks.
we took our battalion test and we scored 40 on it. So the first unit I ever belonged to that went through a test cycle was an abject failure.
Battery test had been okay.
Battery test been okay, but the battalion test wasn't worth a damn. And so they fired the battalion commander.
What had gone wrong? Shells just
What had
weren't on
gone
target?
wrong, I think it'd be best typified by working the troops to a frazzle.
Yeah.
And
So they were like zombies?
and the gunnery problem was not well done. The fire direction problem was not well done. And the troops could get into position, get out of position. The troops could we could do the survey right. I was a battery survey officer, and I was also a battalion survey officer. So we knew how to do all that stuff. It wasn't a problem doing that. The problem was in gunnery, and the problem was in timeliness of fire, which is all a gunnery problem. And the fact the troops are dead. And so a new battalion commander came in.
Were they mad too, or were they sulky?
I couldn't tell that was good. I mean, we're a lot of irritability,
Yeah.
but I couldn't tell that there was any vicious undercurrent of we'll get the battalion. That wasn't it. I mean,
Yeah.
everybody was reasonably well motivated about that.
How did the battery commander handle the interface between these policies that were killing his troops and his officers and NCOs?
Nothing he could do about it, because in his case, he was a lieutenant, so he was a junior officer on the totem pole. Another guy was in the same battalion, is a good friend of mine, Vernon Lewis, and you might get a little view from Vernon Lewis about the same time, because he was a battery commander in the same battalion. He lives here, he runs MPRI down here in Washington. You can sort of talk to him about the 11th Airborne Division, because we were both in the same outfit. The
NCOs, how did they, I mean, they must have been...
sucked it up. They sucked it up, but everybody's just tired. I mean, they just finally ran out of gas. New guy came in, his name was Felix, Russ Felix. And Russ Felix brought in one guy with them in US 3. And Russ Felix said, called all the officers together and said, this is a good battalion. They've given me 30 days to retake the test. So this is a good battalion. We're going to take the test probably next week. And he said, what we're going to go to do, we're going to go to the field now for a So we'll beat 30 days. We'll take it at less than 30 days. So we're going to go to the field now, and we are going to report back to the DeBarty when we're ready to take the test. And I think it'll be long before the 30 days is up. So he said, I have confidence in it. That's what he didn't say it like that, but that's what he was radiating.
Was the S3 a problem? Was he part of the problem?
Yeah, the S3 was a fellow who didn't know his job, didn't know how to organize it. And the fellow that came in was a guy named Foss Cowie, F-O-S-S Cowie, C-O-W-E-Y. And Foss was a class of 46 from West Point, had fought in the Korean War as a battery commander. Now he was Battalion 3. It's a piece of cake. I went to the field in the morning, on Monday morning, came back on Thursday night, cleaned up all the gear on Friday, gave troops off on the weekend, Saturday and Sunday. Went to the field next week on Monday morning, came back on Thursday night, and we were ready to take the test. And we shot 96 on the test. Everybody in the battalion was the same, except the battalion commander and the S3. Only 2 people. That sticks with me later.
Yeah, well, your whole sort of thing is making winners out of who you have.
You get dealt the deck you're dealt, and you get on with it. It's a quote, I guess, from the Red Badge of Courage. You know, you take what you're dealt and make something out of it. I look back on that as one, a division commander could set standards and cause people to hold to them. 2, I don't think he lost any sleep at night about setting those standards for lieutenants to pass these things to get promoted. I mean,
They sound reasonable.
people groused about it. I mean, there was a big bee-ache about it. He also had a terrible training cycle. We went to work at 5:30 in the morning because he wanted to beat the heat, of course, and let the troops off at 1:30 in the afternoon in the summertime at Fort Campbell. And of course, the officers came to work at 3:30 in the morning to get ready to go to work at 5:30. And the officers, of course, had to work in the afternoon, so I mean, Christ, it was working night and day. I mean, it's a terrible scheduling problem, but
Was there that much work to do?
well, I mean,
With
the notion is for a bunch of officers to leave the battery at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and go screw off all afternoon. That was contrary to the way most people thought. Most people thought you had to work during daylight, you know. And you couldn't go back to a BOQ because the temperature at BOQ would be 100 degrees. So I mean, it was a very discombobulating schedule for the summer. But Smith thought he was doing a favor to the troops by keeping them out of the hot sun, hot weather late in the afternoon.
What'd they do? They go back to 100-degree barracks?
Well, yeah, they did. Right. So he had some interesting things. I mean, I'll give you an example. He called in the banker at the bank, at Planters National Bank, and he told the banker the new operating hours of the bank are 1 to 5 instead of 9 to 2 or whatever. And the banker said, no, banker's hours are from 9 to 2. And he said, in that case, get your bank off post. This guy said, geez, I think operating a bank between 1 to 5 would be great. And then he had scouts.
Everybody knew about that in the division?
Huh?
Did everybody know
Oh,
about it?
sure. But you couldn't get a haircut in the morning at the PX. PX was closed in the morning.
He said,
All that ancillary stuff was in the afternoon. Get your hair cut, go to the PX, play golf, play tennis, everything you wanted to do that was what I call, he's trying to optimize people for training, present for duty strength. That's what he's trying to do.
Yeah, okay, that's a perennial problem.
Yeah. But I found that here was a guy that had some standards, and he wasn't embarrassed about putting the standards out. He may not like what he did with it, but he did it. And you towed the line. You didn't get promoted unless you did these kinds of things. The officership was very peculiar in that unit. There was a little club at Fort Campbell, main officers club, and there was a little club down in sort of the BOQ area. And every payday night, there was a tremendous amount of gambling going on in that club. Polo Club. I didn't participate because I wasn't a card player and didn't know a lot about it. Played bridge, but I didn't play any poker or dice and all that stuff. And there was one battalion commander, for example, who would watch a poker game go on, and then he would approach a lieutenant. He was a major. He was battalion commander, major. And he would say to the lieutenant, "I'll buy the check you're holding for 50 cents on the dollar." Because the check would be post-dated to another 30 days or whatever, and he would
give him
cash half on the check. And the lieutenant or captain would take it because it was cash money.
Surely his luck
And
would
the other
turn.
guy knew he had the fellow who issued the check by the neck, you know, if he didn't pay the check, because he'd been a wise old guy that had been left over from World War II and the like. But the notion of the officers, battalion commanders, battalion S3s, battalion executive officers, gambling with the lieutenants on payday night was a tradition in that division, in that division artillery. And the division artillery commander never said anything about it. Nobody ever made anything out of it. It's just what happened there in that particular division. So it's a very unusual legacy left over from principally the 187 Regimental Combat Team, which had fought in Korea, and all these guys had fought together for several years. And then they came back and they were sort of the clique that ran the division artillery. And I was inside that clique, because my brother had been a member of the 187 Regimental Combat Team.
Was he in the 11th Division at that time?
He wasn't in the division.
But you were a hereditary member of the clique.
I was a hereditary, well, that's the reason Leroy Branning, for example, the Sergeant Major said to me, "I'll take care of you for 30 days and you're on your own." So, on the one hand, standards by the division commander, sort of a perverse training schedule